Thank you, Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. At this 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly, I'd like to speak about Africa's role in the future of this organization. However, it's impossible to do that without first considering the collective role that Africa played in its founding, which was small and relatively insignificant. Of the 51 member states involved in the founding of the United Nations in 1945, only 4 were African: Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa. It is important to point out that the United Nations came into being in the aftermath of World War II because of the inability of its predecessor, the League of Nations, to avert a large-scale global conflict, which had been its guiding purpose when it was founded in 1920 at the end of the First World War. Out of the 42 founding member states of the League of Nations, only 3 were African: Liberia, the Union of South Africa, and Ethiopia. Egypt was to join later in 1937. Africa's overall participation in the organization's founding was minimal and relatively unimportant. That's because before all the other talks and meetings, representatives from a group of 14 nations gathered in Berlin for a series of discussions that began in 1884 and which led to the partitioning and formal colonization of the African continent, which is also called the Scramble for Africa. It has famously been written that past is prologue. Well, in the past, the majority of the 54 nations that now comprise Africa were never offered a seat at the table where plans for a new world order were being drawn. But, Madam President, as fate would have it, the tables are turning, and Africa's role in the authorship of whatever is yet to come for this world is going to be huge, and it will be consequential. According to this organization's own projections, by the year 2050, more than 25% of the world's population is expected to come from the African continent. Additionally, by 2050, 1/3 of all young people aged between 15 to 24 will be residing on the African continent. So you see, the future of this world is African. Allow me to say this once again a little louder for those of you in the back. The future is African. Already today, Africa is a catalyst for human potential and development, as well as for economic reform and ecological stability. Africa is a catalyst for systemic change. If this reality, which is fact-based and straightforward, seems provocative or unsettling, perhaps it's because you are viewing it through the lens of centuries of filters, colonialism and imperialism, and the resulting implicit bias. Maybe you are unaware of the resilience of African nations or their remarkable ability to make a strong comeback just when you think it's safe to count them out. That is what is happening right now in my own country, Ghana. Our constitution limits leaders to 2 4-year terms. In January, I was sworn in for a second term, which, let me point out, was non-consecutive with my first term. Our currency, the Ghana cedi, was rapidly depreciating, faced with rising inflation, a huge debt burden, and low morale amongst our citizens. My new administration settled down quickly and embarked on an ambitious program of comprehensive transformation designed to restructure Ghana's economic foundation and enhance our competitive standing globally. We refer to this process of recalibration as our reset agenda. In just 8 months, we have achieved significant reduction in inflation from 23.8% in December 2024 to 11.5% in August 2025, restoring price stability for our citizens. Additionally, our currency, the Ghana cedi, has appreciated considerably against other currencies, with Bloomberg reporting it as the best performing currency in the world at one point. Our improved sovereign credit rating reflects increasing investor confidence in our economy, and our 24-hour economy initiative promises to transform our economy. And there's a renewed willingness amongst our people to trust that their elected officials have Ghana's interests at heart and that we are progressing together. Madam President, I believe that in honor of this milestone celebration, the United Nations should also embark on a process of serious recalibration and establish its own reset agenda. Since the organization's founding, the number of UN member nations has nearly quadrupled. And quite frankly, it is not the same world that it was back then when the UN was formed. I mentioned earlier that I began my second non-consecutive term as president this past January. My first term ended in January 2017. In that span of time, 8 years, the world has changed with such ferocity. My first days in office after my return felt as though I had just awakened from a Rip Van Winkle-style sleep. Now, no, that was only after 8 years. Imagine then what it will be like after 80 years since the founding of the United Nations. In 1945, the sun had not yet set on the largest empire in history. The most common mode of international travel was by sea. The personal computer had not been invented, let alone made portable. And television, a new convenience, was still in its infancy, albeit in black and white color. Relations between the US and the Soviet Union were turning frosty, with Winston Churchill declaring that an iron curtain has descended across the European continent. Fast track 80 years on, in today's world, hundreds of thousands of commercial flights take off and land every day. Libraries have been digitized so that volumes of literature can exist on a small device, small enough to fit inside your pocket. We live in a world of cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence, social media, the internet and its dark hidden dungeon of the dark web, all of which carry a potential threat to global peace and security. Climate change is real, and we're fighting a losing battle against the loss of Maldives and other island nations to the rising sea level, against the loss of Timbuktu to desertification and the Amazon forest to global warming and deforestation. Madam President, the UN Founding Charter is outdated when it comes to representation in this August Assembly. The most powerful post-World War II nations are still being rewarded with an almost totalitarian guardianship over the rest of the world. And yet, the first sentence in Chapter 2, Article 1 of the UN Charter declares that the organization is based on the principle of sovereign equality of all its members. If this were true, and was the case, a continent as large as Africa, with its numerous UN member states, would have at least one permanent seat on the Security Council. Furthermore, we believe that veto power should not be restricted to only 5 nations, nor should it be absolute. There must be a mechanism in this House for the General Assembly to challenge a veto. No single nation should be able to exercise an absolute veto to serve its own interests in a dispute. In 1995, during the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, Nelson Mandela stood in this very spot. And he said, the United Nations has to reassess its role, redefine its profile, and reshape its structures. It should truly reflect the diversity of our universe and ensure equity among the nations in the exercise of power within the system of international relations in general, and the Security Council in particular. I close quotations. 30 years later, we African leaders are still making the same simple request for a permanent seat on the Security Council with the power of a veto. So today, Madam President, I stand here in this exact spot and ask the world, if not now, then when? We demand not only a reform of the Security Council, but also a reset of the global financial architecture, which is currently rigged against Africa. Africa must have a greater say in the world's multilateral financial institutions. And while I'm making requests, I'd like to call for the removal of the blockade on Cuba. As Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, our nation's founder, famously said, "We seek to be friends with all and enemies to none." The Cuban people shed their blood on African soil in the fight against apartheid. And indeed, Cuba has been and continues to be a faithful friend of Africa. You see, the very fact that I can stand here and ask these things and say these things, and the fact that all nations can ostensibly gather here to address critical global issues, air our grievances, and express our concerns, that is what makes the survival of this organization so important. In every old city or village, you will find a town square, or a courtyard, or a plaza that once served as a gathering space for the citizens of the community and their leaders. Meetings and celebrations were held there, as were trials and elections. And these were spaces that brought people together and held them together as a community. Sadly, time and technology have eroded these spaces. Madam President, in many ways, the United Nations is the proverbial town square of our modern global village. And it has never been more critical for us to protect this one space that brings and holds the world nations together as a community. The internet, social media platforms, and artificial intelligence offer us the illusion of connectivity, when in fact what they do is reinforce isolation by using algorithms that ensure that we do not receive new ideas and perspectives, but rather more of the same content. We are served alternative facts and manipulated images, making it easy to disseminate disinformation and sow seeds of division amongst communities. Madam President, these are dangerous times. Our world is currently experiencing a rise in nationalism and economic instability. There's a general breakdown of multilateralism. Various acts of aggression have been committed against the sovereignty of others, and nations are attempting to circumvent the very safeguards that were put in place to prevent large-scale global conflict. These conditions are all too similar to the ones that led to the League of Nations' failure in fulfilling its mandate. The denial of visas to President Abbas and the Palestinian delegation sets a bad precedent and should be deeply worrying to all member nations of the United Nations. Ghana recognized the state of Palestine in 1988 and supported a two-state solution to the conflict since then. And I say, contrary to the claims of some, a two-state solution would not be a reward for Hamas. It would rather be a reprieve for the hundreds of thousands of innocent women and children and people who are facing collective punishment and forced starvation for no reason other than the fact that they are Palestinian. For nearly 2 years and for the fear of reprisals, we here in this General Assembly have been playing hide and seek with language to find the right words to help us avoid or excuse what we all know is taking place in Gaza. But here's the thing, it doesn't matter what you call it. If it looks like a duck, it swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, well, then it must be a duck. The crimes in Gaza must stop. The crimes in Gaza must stop. Madam President, I also want to draw particular attention to the conflict in Sudan, which this body has described as the world's largest humanitarian crisis. 12 million people have had to flee their homes. And when we speak of migration, we refer to the 12 million new Sudanese refugees, whom we as a global community should be willing to assist in much the same way that many member nations readily assisted new refugees coming out of Ukraine. Let's dispense with the euphemisms and dog whistles and speak frankly. It is not a mystery that when leaders of Western nations complain of their migration problems, they are often referring to immigrants from the global south. But many of those migrants are climate refugees. And interestingly, the global north emits 75% more greenhouse gases than the global south. However, the effects of climate change are more severe in the global south because we lack the resources to address them effectively. And so when the desert encroaches on our villages and towns and they become unlivable, we are forced to flee. Wasan Shire, a Somali-born prophet, a Somali-British poet born in Kenya to Somalian refugee parents, was London's first youth poet laureate. She writes in her poem titled Home. And it says, you have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one bends their palms under trains beneath carriages. No one spends days and nights in the stomach of a truck feeding on newspaper unless the miles traveled mean something more than just a journey. Madam President, we cannot normalize cruelty. We cannot normalize hatred. We cannot normalize xenophobia and racism. If we're going to tell a story, let's not tell it slant. Let's tell all the truth. When we speak of migrants, we speak of Mami Ewusi Mensah Frimpong, a judge on the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California. She's the first black female judge on any of California's 4 federal district courts. She was born here in America to immigrant parents from Ghana. We speak of Peter Bosman, a medical doctor in Ghana who moved to the town of Piran in Slovenia in the 1980s and later became the first black mayor of Piran, the first black mayor in Slovenia and in the whole of Eastern Europe. We speak of T. Michael, the iconic Ghanaian Norwegian artist and designer. And of course, we speak of the late Kofi Annan, former United Nations Secretary General. Former United Nations Secretary General and Nobel Peace Prize recipient, who was born in Ghana but spent his adulthood in various places in America and Europe. These are people who have brought great distinction to the countries that they decided to call home. Just as the migrants and the children of migrants before them did, I dare say these are not invaders. These are not criminals. Madam President, the slave trade must be recognized as the greatest crime against humanity. As the African champion on reparations, Ghana intends to introduce a motion in this August body to that effect. More than 12.5 million Africans were forcibly taken against their will and transported to create wealth for the powerful Western nations. We must demand reparations for the enslavement of our people and the colonization of our land that resulted in the theft of our natural resource, as well as the looting of artifacts and other items of cultural heritage that have yet to be returned in total. We recognize the value of our land and the value of our lives, as did our colonizers, as well as the governments that happily paid reparations to former slave owners as compensation for the loss of their property in quotes. And that property for which they received compensation was paid referred to enslaved people who had been freed. Madam President, an increasingly insecure world is witnessing upward spending on defense budgets of bilateral partners and steep cuts in international development assistance. Since July 2024, it is estimated that there's been a 40% drop in humanitarian aid globally. In this era of global uncertainty, Africa must exercise sovereignty over its natural resources to raise the necessary funds to ensure the well-being of its citizens. The days of parceling out vast concession aid to foreign interests for exploitation must come to an end. We'll continue to welcome foreign investment, but we must negotiate better for a bigger share of the natural resources that belong to us. And we must insist on value addition to these resources. We're tired of the continued image of poverty-stricken, disease-ridden rural communities living at the periphery of huge foreign-controlled natural resource concession areas. We're tired of having people extract the most they come from us, in return offer us the very least by way of respect, consideration, dignity. We're tired of not being represented in ways that reveal this and complexity of our history or acknowledge all that we have overcome to arrive here in this liminal space of untold possibilities. Allow me to echo the Indian-American writer Arundhati Roy, who wrote, "Another world is not only possible, she's on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her briefing." I want to add that for the sake of Africa, and quite selfishly for the sake of my 18-year-old daughter, I hope that this new world that is arriving is a place of safety and equality for women and girls. To succeed, we must empower everyone, including women and girls, to reach their full potential. In closing, Madam President, I'd like to congratulate you on your election to preside over this historic 80th General Assembly and on being the 5th woman to hold this distinction. I'd also like to congratulate Her Excellency Nana Jane Opoku-Agyeman on being the first woman Vice President of Ghana. Now every Ghanaian girl knows the heights to which she can ascend. Words matter, but issues of representation matter even more, which is why Ghana looks forward to the appointment of a woman as Secretary General of this organization in the near future. Madam President, Your Excellencies, I thank you for your kind attention.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Ghana.
The Assembly will hear from His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, the President of the Republic of Ghana, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana, and I invite him to address the Assembly.
Thank you. Thank you, my brother and President of the 71st session of the United Nations General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General, colleagues, delegates to the Assembly. Allow me to first congratulate Ambassador Peter Thompson on your election as President of the General Assembly and to assure you of Ghana's support and cooperation during this 71st session and throughout your tenure. I congratulate also Secretary General Ban Ki-moon for his selfless and dedicated service to our organization over the past 8 years and for the achievements during his tenure of office. His time as Secretary General witnessed some key defining moments for the United Nations in the maintenance of international peace and security, development and human rights, and I commend him for his leadership. I am the President of the Republic of Ghana. I was born 1 year after my country gained independence from colonial domination in 1957. I was born in the same year as Michael Jackson, whose untimely tragic death shocked the whole world. Michael was also known as the King of Pop and was one of the greatest entertainers that ever lived. The words of his 1991 hit song, "Heal the World," continues to echo to us from his grave. Michael Jackson sang, and I quote, "Heal the world, make the world a better place for you and for me and the entire human race." His song was released in 1991 and came at a time of excitement for the whole world. In the 58 years of my life, I have seen the world change more rapidly than in the millions of years of its existence. My life has spanned the excitement of the post-war era, the heady days of our liberation from colonial rule in Africa, the Apollo moon landing, the Cold War, the excitement at the fall of the Berlin Wall, the era of globalization, the end of apartheid, the global progress of the MDGs, the Arab Spring, Brexit, China's slowdown, SDGs, ISIS, cyber attacks, and it goes on and on and on and on. Mr. President, our world today is more complicated than it has ever been. And the question I ask is, what happened to the ideals that gave birth to this organization, the United Nations? What happened to that enthusiasm that captured the spirit of the post-war world, that envisioned peace, safety, and security for all of mankind? What happened to the excitement at the thawing of the Cold War? And what happened to our joy at the collapse of apartheid? The era of the Cold War created a paradoxical safety and security. The bipolar world and the arms race assured mutual destruction from any nuclear war. And therefore, the world was a more predictable place. Those of us in developing countries hid behind our shield of the non-aligned movement. We marched against nuclear armaments and envisioned the day the nuclear arms race would end so that the trillions of dollars that were being spent by the superpowers on nuclear weapons will yield a dividend that will create a life of prosperity for all people on earth. President Reagan stood before the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin in 1987 and said, "Mr. Gorbachev," I quote, "Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Quotations closed. In President Reagan's words, walls cannot withstand faith, walls cannot withstand truth, and walls cannot withstand freedom. The fall of the Berlin Wall envisioned a new world, the era of globalization, an age where trade and interaction amongst people of the world would spread prosperity across the globe. It did somewhat. The rise of the Asian tigers, the emerging world, China, Brazil, South Africa, India, the turn of millennium and the MDGs raised millions of people out of poverty. A young man in West Africa drops out of school and takes to selling petty items along the streets of the city. Agreeing with 4 of his friends, they decide to raise money and try to make it to the greener pastures of Europe. They pay their way through Niger and arrive at Agadez, from where they brave the trek of death. This is a dangerous hike across the harshest desert on earth, the Sahara. They are attacked by bandits along the way and robbed of all their money and provisions. They are rescued by some good Samaritan. 2 members of their group do not make it through the desert crossing. After months of living under the threat of death from many of the armed groups, including ISIS in Libya, they finally board an overloaded dinghy bound for Italy. Rescued from the sea after their dinghy capsized, only one of them remained, held in a refugee center in Italy. He is the lucky one, the only one of 5 friends to survive this perilous journey. How long he will remain in the detention center, he does not know. And this could be the story of any young African seeking a better life in Europe. Mr. President, all over the world, there are new walls coming up. Walls that imprison us against the rest of the world. The young African refugee in an Italian detention center is facing one such new wall now. In many parts of the world, extremist forces have hijacked the dialogue, and in the millennial generation, all available cutting-edge technology is being used to spread anxieties that evoke fear and arouse our basest emotions. Hate speech is becoming common. People complain of being tired of being politically correct. In many places, xenophobia has taken over rational thinking. In the vote on Brexit, the spectre of a flood of Syrian refugees was used as the instrument for propelling an exit from the European Union. It is a paradox of our world that nearly 30 years after President Reagan called for the Berlin Wall to be torn down, new walls are springing up everywhere. And yet we have the resources in this world to guarantee each person a decent life. In the implementation of the MDGs, despite the minimal resources that were injected by the wealthy nations, we managed by prioritizing our spending to put more children in school than ever before in our history. We managed to pull more than 40% of the world's people out of extreme poverty. In Valletta, the European Union put 1.8 billion euros into an emergency fund to cooperate with Africa in curbing unregulated migration. And yet, with a significant share of the world's arable lands, a youthful labor force, a significant share of the world's natural resources, a reordering of economic relations could create boundless opportunities that will keep young Africans at home and not risk their lives across these perilous journeys. Removing subsidies to farmers of the advanced world will create an even playing field for African farmers to compete. Removing revenue and non-revenue barriers to African produce would give African agriculture a fighting chance. Mr. President, some of the young Africans who hazard the desert and the Mediterranean Sea to cross to Europe from my country are young poultry farmers or other entrepreneurs who sell their shops and undertake the journey because they can no longer compete with the tons of frozen chicken dumped on African markets annually, or the adverse business environment they have to face. Africa does not need your sympathy or overseas development assistance. Africa needs a fair chance to trade with the rest of the world and amongst ourselves. The progress towards the creation of a continental free trade area is commendable and must be fast-tracked. Raising intra-African trade alone from the paltry average of 15% will create better business opportunities for African youth. We can achieve a lot in collaboration with the rest of the world, and yet we must realize that a lot also rests within our own capacity to achieve as Africans. Recently, I took the decision as president to allow citizens of other African countries traveling to Ghana to obtain visas on arrival. This would stimulate trade and investment if it were replicated across the whole of the continent. Structural reforms are required in many areas. Governance is also a critical area that requires reform in Africa. Democracy unleashes the creative juices of our citizens. Africa has made remarkable progress. Elections are held regularly, civil society groups and think tanks have become more vocal, and the media is increasingly free. And yet there's a lot more that we can do to allow Africans the space to express themselves. Democracy is not a one-size-fits-all system. Different countries are at different stages of the democratic journey. Democracy evolves and cannot be forced on a people. It doesn't help for biggest powers to go proselytizing democracy across the continent. It can have its negative consequences, as we're experiencing in parts of North Africa and the Middle East. But still, a properly functioning peer system can avoid some of the meltdowns we're experiencing in some African countries due to the desire to remain in office interminably. Mr. President, the mistake with Africa is that we're seen as a homogeneous unit and treated as such, not taking cognizance that we are a whole continent with different aspirations, different cultures, democracies, and even economic development. Human progress is not a seamless movement forward. It encompasses periods of reversal, mistakes, fumbling, and even falling. All parts of the world have been through this. They have learned from their mistakes, they've picked themselves up after a fall, and they've continued moving forward. Africa must be allowed the same latitude. A few years ago, the term African Rising painted a continent on the move. Recent headwinds experienced due to China's slowdown and the collapse of commodity prices have got some African skeptics gloating again over how nothing good can come out of this continent. Africa is a continent of 54 countries at different stages of progress and development. And there must be room for us to make our mistakes and learn from those mistakes. Africa has the potential to be the next continent on the rise. There's a lot going for Africa. There are many success stories on the continent. Africa has the fastest growing population, meaning a very youthful labor force. It has the fastest growing middle class with increasing disposable incomes. It has the fastest growing information and communication technology networks in the world. Africa needs strengthened institutions, and we're working to build them. We must ingrain transparency and integrity more and more in our governance systems. President Obama said on his historic visit to Ghana that what Africa needs is strong institutions. We must strengthen our institutions of governance to eliminate the incidence of corruption that impoverishes our people. Mr. President, my country, Ghana, is a part of Africa's success story. I'm proud of my country. We're variously called the model of democracy in Africa or the beacon of democracy. We've not looked back since the adoption of our 1992 Constitution. Successive elections with power occasionally swinging between opposing political parties has established Ghana's democratic credentials in the world. A strict two-term limit for the president means that every 8 years it is guaranteed that there will be a new person in charge. Ghana has a fiercely independent media with hundreds of newspapers and radio stations. And I always say jokingly to my colleagues that in Ghana, I have 27 million presidents, all of whom know my job better than I. And every morning, on the political talk shows across the country, my fellow citizens can be heard coaching me on how to do my job and what my responsibilities are as president. Mr. President, bold measures in effecting structural reforms have yielded a more stable and resilient economy with a deficit to GDP target of 4.9% this year, among other favorable targets. With a stable currency, business confidence is rising, and foreign direct investment remains very strong. Ghana has been chugging along at a respectable average of about 6% GDP growth rate over the last decade. With the structural reforms we have undertaken in collaboration with our development partners and new developments in our offshore oil and gas prospects, Ghana is predicted to clip along from next year at a respectable 8% growth per annum. Over the last decade, we have invested heavily in expanding our socio-economic infrastructure. Investments in healthcare, education, power, water, roads, and ports are yielding significant dividends for us and are creating more employment opportunities for our young people. These investments are yielding dividends in improved healthcare, increased enrollments at all levels of the educational ladder, improved transportation systems, the growth of small and medium enterprises. With the modest progress we are making, we're able to recapture the vision of the founder of our nation. And it is a happy coincidence that on his birth anniversary, that is today, I have the opportunity to address the world from the prestigious platform of the United Nations General Assembly. Today, the 21st of September, marks the birthday of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, from whom many of our current generation of African leaders draw inspiration. President Kwame Nkrumah was a champion of African liberation and a staunch Pan-Africanist. I wish all my countrymen and women a happy Founders' Day. Mr. President, 2 years ago, I stood on this stage, and in my capacity as the chair of the Economic Community of West African States, I called for urgent action to halt the spread of the Ebola virus disease, which was ravaging 3 of our West African neighbors and threatening to spread across the whole of the sub-region. Today I stand here to salute Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and the United Nations for the prompt response in setting up UNGA, which was based in Ghana. UNGA will probably go down in the history of the UN as one of the most successful and effective missions ever deployed by this organization. I salute also the international community for the effective response in the form of logistics, personnel, medication, and other material which helped to snuff out the disease in a relatively short time. But my particular commendation goes to the brave volunteers, including 41 of my own countrymen, who risked their lives by going into the infection zone to assist fight the disease. Ghana remains proud of its contribution towards ending that crisis and the support to the UN system and the international community when we availed our country as the staging post for the international response and the UN mission on Ebola emergency response, despite the threats. Following the Ebola response, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, Norwegian Prime Minister Erna Solberg, and I wrote to the General Secretary General, calling for a high-level panel to prepare a report that allows the world to respond better in times of such global health crisis. We are faced with such a situation already in respect of the exponential spread of the Zika virus. We must use the lessons learned from the Ebola crisis to confront this new threat. Mr. President, another threat we must confront together as a united world is the threat of terrorism. No part of the world is safe. In our sub-region, the activities of Boko Haram in northeastern Nigeria and the Chad Basin has displaced millions of people and claimed thousands of casualties. Attacks in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Cote d'Ivoire show that all our countries are at risk. Terrorism is currently one of the gravest threats to world peace and security today. We cannot be under any illusions about the imminent threat to all of us, even as we go about our daily activities. But the solution is not to shut out our doors to foreigners who may have genuine cause for visiting, for tourism, for business, for sanctuary as refugees. That is what the terrorists would want us to do, to instill fear and panic in us in order that we shut our doors on the rest of the world. Ghana stands in solidarity with all countries that have experienced terrorism recently: Bangladesh, Belgium, France, Germany, Indonesia, Lebanon, Pakistan, the Russian Federation, Turkey, and of course the United States of America. No, we must not give in to them. The terrorists must not win, they cannot win, and they will not win. Mr. President, I wish to commend the United States and Cuba for the progress made in thawing the relations between the two neighbors. We've all been watching with excitement the removal of some of the last vestiges of the Cold War with the reopening of embassies in the two capitals, the historic visit of President Obama, and the resumption of flights between the two countries. It is time to take the remaining steps to completely lift the blockade on Cuba, and it is my hope that this can be achieved. And it is my hope that this can be achieved before President Obama's administration leaves office. Mr. President, Ghana once again wishes to reiterate its support for a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There is no military solution to this conflict, and Israel's security can only be guaranteed by a peaceful and stable Palestinian state coexisting side by side. Unfortunately, the illegal occupation of Palestinian lands continues to make such a solution more and more difficult to attain. Mr. President, last September we convened in this very hall and made a commitment to implement the Agenda for Sustainable Development. It is an ambitious and yet achievable agenda whose goals and targets go far beyond the imperatives of economic growth into tackling the root causes of poverty and deprivation and to delivering on the social and environmental dimensions of development. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development marks not only the beginning of a new and even more promising phase in our trajectory as a global body, but also challenges us to develop new and innovative partnerships that I believe will guarantee progress evenly across regions and for all people. The 17 goals and 169 targets underscore the underlying values of the United Nations as enshrined in its charter and provide renewed impetus to its activities in sustaining peace, preserving our planet, and ensuring socio-economic justice, as well as safeguarding the dignity of mankind. Mr. President, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for Development, together with the Sustainable Development Goals, represent 4 important mutually reinforcing landmark agreements that open a new chapter in global development towards ensuring prosperity for all our people and preserving our planet. I'm impressed by the level of commitment that the US and China, 2 of the major emitters of greenhouse gases, have shown by agreeing to ratify the Paris Agreement. I hope that this will be the catalyst that brings the agreement into force and unequivocally state our commitment as a generation towards bequeathing a better world to future generations. Mr. President, we must not fail to do this. It is also our responsibility as leaders to move beyond norm setting to delivering on our commitments at the national, regional, and global levels. Even if we do not achieve all at the same time, it must not be for want of effort. Mr. President, I'm particularly honored to have the opportunity to co-chair the Secretary General's advocacy group in support of the SDGs. While we acknowledge that national leadership and ownership are critical, there is a need for global partnerships for financial resources, policy advice, and technical assistance. I'm happy to inform you, Mr. President, that Ghana has begun work in earnest to implement the SDGs, and we've put into place the necessary national structures to ensure that the policies and measures taken in that regard fall in line with our 40-year development plan currently being formulated. I've also signed the ratification instrument of the Paris Agreement and will be part of the event today that deposits Ghana's instrument with the United Nations. Mr. President, the United Nations Security Council remains an important source of legitimacy for international action on peace and security. While Africa accounts for close to 1/3 of the UN membership and nearly 2/3 of the work of the Council, it remains woefully underrepresented in the permanent and non-permanent categories. 11 long years after the African Union adopted the Eswatini Consensus, we are nowhere near achieving a more equitable reform of the UN Security Council. Mr. President, this will continue to remain a scar on the conscience of this world body if not remedied as quickly as possible. Mr. President, Ghana is a leading democracy in Africa. I stand before the world today to declare that just as we have done in the past, my country will go to the polls this December. And the processes before, during, and after will mark a further consolidation of Ghana's credentials as a leading world democracy. In conclusion, let me once again express my sincere appreciation to Secretary General Ban Ki-moon for his extraordinary leadership during his tenure as Secretary General of the United Nations. The people of Ghana, my wife and I, wish you and Mrs. Ban Suntaik well in your future endeavors. It is my wish that history will record our time here in this UN General Assembly Hall as one that gave reality to Michael Jackson's song, "Heal the world, make the world a better place for you and for me and for the entire human race." Mr. President, I thank you for the opportunity.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Ghana for the statement that he has just made. May I request representatives to remain seated while we greet the President.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Your Excellency, President of the 70th session of the UN General Assembly, Secretary General of the United Nations, Your Excellencies, heads of state and government, delegates to the Assembly, ladies and gentlemen. Let me congratulate the Secretary General and the staff of the United Nations, and indeed all member states, on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of this all-important international organization. Study history. Winston Churchill, the famous British Prime Minister, once said, "For in history lies all the secrets of statecraft." And so we study history in millions and millions of schools all across the world. There are untold numbers of students studying history, learning about the events of our past, and in the pages of those books they use to study, history is compressed and reduced to its barest essentials. The enormity of a whole era is whittled down to mere paragraphs, with significant events carefully packaged into simple sentences. Nevertheless, within those pages are indeed the secrets of statecraft. Within those pages, we come to understand what our world once was and the process by which it evolved to become what the world is today. In those pages, we learn from the mistakes that were made. Mr. President, the world into which the United Nations was born 70 years ago seems like such a faraway reality. In 1945, the names that filled the newspapers were Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Dresden, and even the Red Army. In 1945, Ecuador declared war on Germany and Japan. Syria also declared war on Germany and Japan. The Soviet Union was victorious in the Battle of Königsberg, as well as the Vienna Offensive. Spain broke off diplomatic relations with Japan, and the historically neutral Switzerland closed its borders with Germany. And these are just a few of the events that took place before the watershed San Francisco Conference in April of that year, when 50 nations convened to declare their commitment to peace. My country, Ghana, was not among those nations. It would take another 22 long years for the then Gold Coast colony to gain its independence and become Ghana. In fact, Mr. President, a great number of the countries represented here in these debates of the General Assembly, particularly those from the so-called developing world, were not in existence as sovereign nations. Nevertheless, here we are today, very much a part of this organization, aptly called the United Nations, and very much a part of this world. And this is why, Mr. President, I wish to state quite emphatically at the start of my address that it is time for greater inclusivity in the United Nations. Truth be told, it is long past time. The world that was in 1945 does not exist now in 2015. So the visionary organization that was formed to meet the needs of that world must now be reformed to meet the needs of today's world. And Mr. President, those needs are many. The names that fill the newspapers of today are ISIS, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, the hashtags that circulate on social media now, and I'll say their names, are of Sandra Bland, who died under suspicious circumstances while in police custody in Texas, Aylan Kurdi, a young Syrian boy who, along with his family, washed up on the shores of a beach in Turkey, Madao Gach Dut, one of the thousands who have died in the conflict in southern Sudan. I could go on and on because the names are many. The lists are long. Thousands dead in Syria, in Pakistan, in Nigeria, in Mexico, Afghanistan, and Somalia. Thousands more, the majority from African nations, dead in the Mediterranean Sea, while attempting to flee poverty, hunger, disease, or political strife or persecution. Then too, there are those who did not die while seeking refuge, those whose perilous journeys landed them safely at the borders of other nations, some welcoming their arrival and others subjecting them to further alienation and degradation. Mr. President, the numbers are staggering. This isn't history that is being taught in schools, not yet anyway. These are not events written in a book condensed into nicely worded paragraphs and sentences. Events that happened once upon a time in a world long gone. These are events happening today. These are events happening in our time. And as we gather here today to discuss the road ahead, I wish to echo a few words written in the speech that Franklin Roosevelt, before his untimely death, had been writing and preparing to deliver at that fateful San Francisco conference. Mr. Roosevelt wrote, "The work, my friends, is peace. And despite all the changes that have occurred in the world over the course of the last 70 years, that singular truth remains the same. But peace, as so many great men and women have reminded us, is not just the absence of war. Peace is also the presence of dignity in one's life. It is the achievement of equality in one's endeavors, and it is the respect of one's humanity and attendant rights. If we are to discuss the road ahead, we must do so with a new language, with ideas and solutions that do not exist only in the annals of history. And we must begin with an examination of our most basic institutions, the governmental, the cultural, the societal, and the personal. Some of the very institutions that were set in place to promote and protect and promote peace are the very ones violating their mandates and engendering fear in the public. When one race of citizens feel as though their lives don't matter, when refugees successfully escape the horrors of war only to be further brutalized on foreign soil, when the already traumatized victims of conflict are violated by international peacekeepers who were sent there to ensure their safety and well-being, then we as leaders, we as a world community must stop being silent and start taking action. We must create change, because fear serves as fuel for disillusionment and apathy, for hatred and xenophobia, all of which are the seeds, if which allowed to root, will ultimately grow and bear the rotten fruit of war. What we learned 70 years ago with the formation of the United Nations is that we must each be our brother's keeper. We must allow ourselves as people, and even more so as nations, to belong to one another. In Ghana, we are also reviewing our rules of engagement to create a balance between the maintenance of law and order and the basic rights of our people to free speech and free expression. Mr. President, since the beginning of time, cultural and societal traditions have been used as markers of identity. Kente cloth is as defining to Ghana as kimonos are to Japan and as quinceañeras are to Latin America, or as bar mitzvahs are to Judaism. Yet some practices and beliefs, though considered traditional, have no place in our world today, and they should not be permitted a place in the world that we are planning for the future. Among those traditions are the ones that refuse individuals, particularly women and children, their basic rights and force them into situations that relegate them to a life of vulnerability, to poverty, to disease, and other unbearable hardships. Most of the world's poorest people are women. Currently, we create programs and policies to address this imbalance, yet regardless of how successful they may be, they are not permanent solutions. They do not solve the ultimate problem, which is the vast inequality that exists between men and women that so many traditions have inculcated over the years. In Ghana, through the Livelihood Empowerment Against Poverty program, we have provided cash grants to a total of 77,000 households throughout our nation. The program, which is aimed at poverty alleviation, also entitles its recipients to provision of free health care through the National Health Insurance Scheme. In order to address the issue of child mortality and malnutrition, preparatory work is underway to earmark disbursements for pregnant women and mothers of children under the age of 1. It is not a secret that when it comes to gender equality, education is the key to change. It is a problem that must be addressed at its root. We speak often of ability and access. Those are honorable concepts. But the actuality is that being able to get an education and having access to an education is not the same as getting an education. In Ghana, we've made tremendous progress in achieving the Millennium Development Goal target on universal basic education. We instituted the Girl Child program, which encourages parents to send girls to school, and at the primary level, we have achieved gender parity between boys and girls. But what happens beyond the basic level is another matter altogether. Young girls are often taken out of school and married off. Africa has the highest rates of child marriage in the world, following only Asia. It was the intention of the United Nations 1964 Convention on Consent to Marriage and Minimum Age for Marriage and Registration of Marriages to abolish the practice of child marriage. And yet still in West Africa, 2 out of 5 girls will be married off before the age of 18. These young girls are faced with increased maternal mortality rates and increased STD rates. They are subject to the sort of poverty that is nearly insurmountable. However, research shows that 64% fewer girls will become child brides if they were allowed to complete secondary school. Recognizing the significant difference that this could make in and to our nation, Ghana has launched a campaign under the auspices of UNICEF to end child marriage in our nation by focusing not only on getting young girls into school, but also keeping them there until their education is complete. This is being achieved through enhanced access to secondary education and beyond without compromising quality. Mr. President, this year we've had a fruitful General Assembly. We adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. We discussed how to establish resilient health systems. We held a summit on peacekeeping, and we also strategized on how to deal with religious extremism. We will take many memories back with us, but for me, one remarkable image that made a huge impression on me in the early days of this gathering was the Pope's car. It was breathtaking to watch the pontiff as he greeted massive crowds and moved even government officials to tears in an open gallery. But nothing was more breathtaking than watching him entering and being driven through the streets of New York in a tiny Fiat 500. It was a great metaphor for the times in which we are living, and a powerful lesson about the certain changes we must make to confront our rapidly changing future. There was a strange sense of solidarity that I felt with this small vehicle as I watched it cruising down the streets of New York, surrounded and dwarfed by such humongous sports utility vehicles. It reminded me of the plight of the so-called developing nations in our relationships with the wealthier, larger, more established nations of this world. There is a sense of being protected, yet also of being overpowered, of being guided, and yet also of being intimidated to stay the course that they are navigating. More than any of that, though, what struck me was the modernity of the moment. The survival of our planet depends on us coming to terms with such modernity. It requires us to redefine our relationship with nature and to realize that we're just one part of a larger ecosystem. We must finally realize that it is we who are dependent upon nature and not the other way around. In recent years, signs of emergence in Africa has generated great hope and very high expectations. Many African nations have embraced democracy, and free and fair elections have become a regular occurrence on the continent's calendar. Several African nations are seeing an acceleration in economic growth, and a more than reasonable measure of success is being achieved in reducing hunger and poverty on the continent. My own country, Ghana, has benefited greatly in achieving the Millennium Development Targets. Ghana is considered one of the bright lights of Africa, a place that was once derisively referred to as the Dark Continent. Our nation boasts a strong, stable democracy with an economy that has been growing positively for more than 2 decades. While we are exposed to the current uncertainty of the international markets, strong cooperation with our multilateral and bilateral partners is seeing positive movement towards fiscal consolidation. Moreover, our current agenda for transformation is aimed at diversifying our economy and accelerating growth. My government is committed to maintaining strict fiscal discipline in order to stabilize the macroeconomy and stimulate growth and business activity. All of that notwithstanding, one of the major binding constraints that all of Africa faces is a shortage of electric power, and Ghana is no exception. In many African nations, power outages as a result of a shortfall in generation are even considered normal. In Ghana, 2 decades of consistent positive growth has resulted in demand for power outstripping supply. The resulting load management program has unfortunately slowed growth and is taking a steep toll on economic and social life. Small and medium enterprises which can least afford the high cost of purchasing and operating generators to substitute their power supply are being severely affected by this. We're pursuing a program to put in emergency generation to balance demand and supply. Looking forward, we plan to put an additional 3,500 megawatts of power into our transmission grid, utilizing the significant gas reserves we have discovered in our offshore concessions. This will be supplemented by renewable power, mainly from solar, biomass, and wind sources. The road ahead, not only for so-called developing nations like Ghana, but indeed for all nations, demand that we achieve energy sufficiency in a manner that is sustainable and does not further worsen the fragile environment of our planet. In December, representatives from all over the world will meet in Paris to discuss issues of climate change, the effects of which have become undeniable. The changes to our planet as a result of global warming are apparent for all to see. The receding glaciers in temperate climates, the reduction in rainfall and advancing deserts in Africa, and the lakes in the Middle East and Asia that are virtually disappearing. All of these things are a wake-up call for us to take drastic and immediate action to save our planet and to save mankind. We must curb our consumerism, not just in respect of the environment, but also in the exercise of tolerance and the mindful practice of coexistence with one another. Recently, the US and Cuba have taken significant steps to normalize relations between the two countries. This is an important first step towards discarding the relics of the Cold War, represented by the economic blockade of Cuba. I'm also encouraged by the historic agreement between the US and partners on one hand and Iran on the other to curtail the development of nuclear weapons and encourage the peaceful use of nuclear technology. These events give me hope that with dedication and focus, we can also resolve the seeming intractable issue of Palestine. Ghana supports a two-state solution to the conflict, a peaceful and stable Israel coexisting with a sovereign Palestinian state. To this end, we call for an immediate cessation of construction of settlements in Palestinian territories. Mr. President, 70 years from now, I wonder what those looking back at this era will think of it. I wonder what they will think of us when they study these days, these events that are shaping our world and our lives, those millions and millions of students, girls and boys. What will our actions or our inactions say to them? What secrets